What if the greatest act of leadership is not commanding others to follow but risking everything to seek the lost? Let me tell you the story of a shepherd, a storm, and a love so powerful it changes everything. And by the end you may find that the shepherd's journey is your own. The story begins in the bustling town of Capernaum, where life spills out onto the streets in vibrant chaos. Fishermen haul their nets by the shore, their voices carrying over the rhythmic crash of waves. Children dart between market stalls, their laughter mingling with the calls of merchants selling figs, olives, and woven fabrics. Amid this lively scene, Jesus and his disciples make their way to a quiet grove on the hillside overlooking the Sea of Galilee. The golden light of the setting sun bathes the landscape, painting the water with hues of amber and crimson. As the group settles beneath the sprawling branches of an ancient olive tree, there's an unmistakable tension in the air. Peter and Andrew whisper heatedly about how best to handle growing challenges in their ministry. John, ever gentle, watches them with a mix of concern and patience, while Judas sits apart, his face unreadable, his gaze distant. Jesus, observing their restlessness, says nothing at first. Instead, he gestures for them to sit, offering bread and water to soothe their weariness. The evening breeze carries the scent of wildflowers, and as the disciples begin to relax, Jesus smiles, sensing that the time for a lesson is near. With the group now settled, Jesus leans forward, his eyes alight with a quiet intensity. "Let me tell you about a shepherd," he begins, his voice carrying the cadence of someone who speaks not just to ears but to hearts. The disciples' attention sharpens, drawn in by his tone. Jesus describes the shepherd, a young man full of hope and devotion, who inherited his father's flock after years of learning the craft. The shepherd rises before dawn each day, leading his sheep through dew-covered fields, his staff steady in his hand. He sings to them, his voice a gentle melody that calms even the most anxious lambs. Jesus paints a vivid picture of the shepherd's bond with his flock. He knows each one by name, he says, his gaze sweeping over the disciples as though he sees them as the shepherd sees his sheep. When one strays, his heart aches until it is found. As Jesus speaks, the disciples begin to see parallels between the shepherd and their own experiences with Jesus. Peter frowns slightly, troubled by his own impatience in leadership, while John's expression softens, resonating with the shepherd's care for the vulnerable. The story has only just begun, yet its message already stirs something deep within them. The story shifts to a fateful evening in the shepherd's life. Dark clouds gather over the hills, their edges tinged with an ominous gray. The air grows heavy, and the shepherd senses the storm before it arrives. His loyal sheepdog Mara paces restlessly, her sharp barks a warning of what's to come. The shepherd moves quickly, guiding the flock toward the safety of their pen. The sheep, usually docile, grow skittish as the first drops of rain begin to fall, turning the dry earth into slick mud. The wind howls, carrying with it the scent of danger. Jesus describes the storm with such vivid detail that the disciples feel as though they are there, the rain stinging their skin, the thunder shaking the ground beneath their feet. As the storm intensifies, the shepherd realizes with dread that some of his sheep have scattered. Despite his exhaustion and fear, he grabs his lantern and staff, plunging into the storm. The disciples exchange glances, their expressions tense. "Would you do the same?" Jesus asks them quietly, his question lingering in the air like the storm's own thunder. Peter hesitates, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty, while John silently reflects on the cost of such devotion. The shepherd's journey into the storm becomes a test of both his strength and his love for his flock. Rain lashes against him, soaking through his cloak and chilling him to the bone. His lantern flickers, barely illuminating the treacherous path ahead. He calls out for his sheep, his voice straining against the roar of the wind. One by one he finds them. The first is tangled in brambles, its frightened bleats piercing through the storm. The shepherd's hands are cut and bleeding as he frees the animal, but he speaks to it softly, "It's all right. You're safe now." As he continues, the shepherd begins to question his own limits. How far must I go? He wonders, his legs aching and his heart pounding. Yet every time he considers stopping, he remembers his father's words. A true shepherd never abandons his flock, no matter the cost. Jesus pauses here in his storytelling, letting the disciples feel the weight of the shepherd's struggle. What would you do? He asks again. This time, even Judas shifts uncomfortably, though he says nothing. The disciples are beginning to see that the shepherd's journey is not just physical but deeply spiritual, a journey of love and sacrifice. The storm's climax comes when the shepherd discovers the smallest lamb of the flock, trembling and trapped in a thorn bush. The lamb's wool is soaked and matted, its tiny body shivering with fear. The shepherd hesitates for a brief moment, his own body battered and bleeding. He knows that freeing the lamb will mean enduring even more pain. Yet, without a second thought, he kneels in the mud, carefully untangling the lamb from the cruel thorns. Each movement costs him, the sharp branches tearing at his skin, but he never falters. When the lamb is finally free, the shepherd cradles it close to his chest, shielding it from the rain with his own body. He whispers soothingly, "I've got you. You're safe now." The lamb's cries quiet, and it nestles into the warmth of his arms. Jesus' voice softens as he recounts this moment, and the disciples are visibly moved. Peter's hand tightens around his staff, his mind racing with thoughts of his own failures and fears. John, meanwhile, wipes a tear from his cheek, overcome by the image of such pure, selfless love. Back in the grove, the disciples sit around a small fire, the flickering flames casting long shadows on their faces. The storm in the story has passed, but its lessons linger. Jesus explains the significance of the shepherd's actions, his words gentle yet piercing. A true leader follows the cries of the lost before leading them to safety. He says, his gaze resting on each disciple in turn. Peter looks down, his heart heavy with self-doubt. "What if I lose my way?" he finally asks, his voice barely above a whisper. Jesus places a hand on Peter's shoulder, his touch warm and reassuring. "Even leaders stumble," he says, his voice filled with compassion. "But love will guide you back." The disciples sit in reflective silence, the weight of the story settling over them like the night's quiet stillness. Around the fire, they begin to share their own fears and struggles, their bonds deepening as they realize that leadership is not a solitary burden but a shared journey. The disciples' reflections are interrupted the next morning by the arrival of a young woman named Miriam. Her face is streaked with tears, her clothes worn and dust-covered. She falls at Jesus' feet, pleading for help. "Master," she cries, her voice breaking, "our village is starving. The crops have failed and the well has run dry. Please help us." The disciples exchange uneasy glances. The journey to Miriam's village is long and treacherous, passing through rocky terrain and hostile territories. Peter steps forward, his natural leadership instincts taking over. "We'll help her," he says firmly, though there's a flicker of doubt in his eyes. Judas, standing apart, mutters under his breath, "This is not our problem. We can't save everyone." Jesus looks at the group, his expression calm yet expectant. "What would the shepherd do?" he asks simply. His question silences their doubts. As they prepare for the journey, the disciples begin to see Miriam as one of the shepherd's lost sheep, her cries calling them into the storm. The journey to Miriam's village becomes a crucible for the disciples. They face physical exhaustion, disagreements over strategy, and moments of deep frustration. Peter struggles to balance his natural impulsiveness with the patience needed to lead. John, ever compassionate, takes on the role of mediator, soothing tensions and encouraging unity. Even Judas, though reluctant, contributes in his own way, his actions revealing glimpses of the man he could have been. As the disciples approach Miriam's village, Jesus continues the shepherd's story. The storm has passed and the shepherd sits among his flock, his body battered but his heart full. He watches as the sheep, once timid and scattered, now huddle close, their trust in him unshaken. For the first time, he understands that his strength as a leader comes not from commanding the flock but from following their needs, seeking them in their fear and meeting them with love. The disciples listen intently, their own journey echoing the shepherd's experience. Peter reflects on his struggles to guide the group without losing his temper. The shepherd didn't force the sheep to follow him, he muses aloud. He earned their trust. Jesus nods, his expression warm and approving. A true leader does not demand loyalty, he says. He inspires it. In Miriam's village, the disciples are met with a scene of despair. Children sit listlessly by empty wells, their faces gaunt. The villagers are wary at first, but Miriam's trust in Jesus opens their hearts. The disciples work tirelessly, digging new wells, sharing their food and offering comfort. As they labor, they begin to see themselves as the shepherds of this small flock, their actions guided by love and compassion. The disciples' efforts are tested when a group of local leaders arrives, angry and suspicious. "Who are you to interfere in our village?" one of them demands. The tension is palpable and Peter steps forward, his heart pounding. He remembers the shepherd's story and takes a deep breath. "We came because we heard your cries," he says calmly. "We only wish to help." The villagers, moved by the disciples' kindness, begin to speak in their defense. A young boy, clutching a small lamb to his chest, steps forward. "They gave me bread when I was hungry," he says, his voice trembling but firm. "They fixed the well so my sister could drink." The leaders, seeing the change in their people, reluctantly back down. That evening, the disciples gather around a small fire, much like the one in the grove. Peter looks at Jesus, his face lined with exhaustion but also with peace. "I think I understand now," he says. "Leadership isn't about being the strongest or the loudest. It's about love. It's about being willing to go into the storm no matter the cost." Jesus smiles, his eyes shining with pride. "Yes, Peter," he says softly. "And that is why you will lead my flock." The story concludes back in the grove under the same olive tree where it began. Jesus gathers his disciples once more, his voice filled with quiet authority. The shepherd's journey is not over, he tells them. Every day he must rise and walk with his flock, guiding them to green pastures and still waters. And every day he must be ready to follow the cries of the lost. The disciples sit in reflective silence, the weight of Jesus' words settling over them. They think of Miriam, her village now thriving. They think of the young boy with the lamb, his trust in them unwavering. They think of the storm, both in the story and in their own lives, and how it has shaped them. Jesus rises, his gaze sweeping over his followers. "Go now," he says, his voice both commanding and tender. "Be the shepherds who lead with love. Seek the lost. Tend the wounded. Walk into the storms and never abandon your flock." As the disciples leave the grove, the golden light of dawn breaks over the hills. They walk with renewed purpose, their hearts burning with the wisdom Jesus has imparted. Each step they take is a step toward their own journey as shepherds, their lives forever changed by the story of the man who led with love. This is end of the story. Comment amen if you believe in Jesus' blessings. Please like this video and subscribe this channel for more Jesus story like this. May the God watch over you.